Welcome everyone to our first virtual seminar organised by the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. My name is Staffordshire. I'm the current president of the society, and we've decided to organise these virtual get-togethers to share a new novel research in our field, and the virtual seminars will consist of a 30-minute paper given by experts in the field in different disciplines, ranging from archaeology to linguistics to literary studies to philology to medievalism, followed by a Q&A, some announcements, and then we'll have a digital social gathering at the end of the seminars. The papers will be recorded and will be put on YouTube at some point. We're trying to figure out how that works. But the Q&A and everything after the paper will not be recorded. So that's for members only. So do become a member of the society if you want to join this lovely community. We're very proud and we're very thankful to have as our first speaker Fern, who's an archaeologist and has worked in heritage for over 20 years. He's worked freelance until last year when he started working as project manager for Cotswold Archaeology, based at their Suffolk office. He's a specialist in the field of early medieval archaeology in England, and he's contributed research in articles, chapters, books on various aspects of funerary archaeology, horse culture, fine metalworking and animal art. And most notably, his work has included work on Sutton Hoo and the Staffordshire Hoard. He was the specialist lead for the Historic England Staffordshire Hoard project from 2010 to 2016. He's the author of various books, editor of various books, including Beasts, Birds and Gods, Interpreting the Staffordshire Hoard, the monograph, The Staffordshire Hoard and Anglo-Saxon Treasure, which won the ISSEME 2021 Best Book Award, and a new book is coming out written by Chris as well as Jenny Butterworth called Warrior Treasure, The Staffordshire Hoard in Anglo-Saxon England. So we're very glad that Chris is willing to share some of his research, and we're curious to find out what else has been found out about the Staffordshire Hoard. So I'll gladly hand over to Chris. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to present this first in your seminar series. It's a real honour. Nice to be here. Right. Well, as I'm sure many of you will know, of course, that the Staffordshire Hoard is an extraordinary and unparalleled, magnificent discovery from early medieval England. The largest collection of treasure from the period that's ever been found. And it involves a unique combination of objects. Most of them are military, but there's also a smaller but overtly Christian group of objects. These objects, dated to between about 550 and 650 AD, are almost all of gold or silver, and many of them are inlaid with semi-precious garnets. And they display the highest quality craft working and artistry of the period as well. However, the collection was very fragmented as found. Virtually all of the finds are fittings that were dismantled from larger objects, in the main from swords, the key weapon of the age. Its significance as arguably the most important archaeological discovery for early England since the ship burial of Mound 1 at Sutton Hoo, found in 1939, has been apparent ever since the hoard was found in July 2009. It was discovered by a metal detectorist near Lichfield, just to the north of Birmingham. As a treasure in the true sense of the word, it is utterly captivating for scholars and the public alike. But what sort of assemblage was it exactly? how was it brought together, and why was it buried? Now, in this lecture, I shall present some of the answers that have emerged from the extensive programme of conservation and research that was carried out on the Hoard under the auspices of Historic England and the joint owners of the collection, Birmingham and Stoke-on-Trent City Councils. I hope it'll give you a taste of the final publication that has already been mentioned, the Big Green Book, which was published by the Society of Antiquaries and which has a digital component. And the whole of that book and its digital aspect can be downloaded for free now on the open access website and at the ADS, the Archaeological Data Services. So you can still buy it in hard copy if you wish, but you can also download it for free. There is also, as has been mentioned, the second book, Warrior Treasure, which I've written with Jenny Butterworth, and that's intended as a more easily digestible read. Note what I'm presenting today it depends enormously on the work of multiple contributors, over 25 specialists, individuals, not least of whom are my fellow editors on the monograph, Tanya Dickinson and Leslie Webster. Now, in what follows, I shall first set out the essential character of the Hoard and its chronology. Then I will present the case for what we think the Hoard is, viewed in its historical and archaeological context, and the arguments for why it might have been collected together and deposited. Now, the Hoard was found on a ridge of land close to the modern A5 and M6 roads, as I said, just north of Birmingham. The metal detectorist who found it, Terry Herbert, spent about a week recovering finds before he informed the Portable Antiquities of his incredible discovery. This then enabled professional archaeologists to become involved. Initially, Staffordshire County Council dug a 1 metre by 1 metre test pit over the focus of the discovery of the concentration of finds, and this was then expanded to a larger full recovery excavation and wider geophysical survey by Birmingham Archaeology, who conducted further research in 2010. And then in 2012, Archaeology Warwickshire undertook more surveying work and found a further 80 finds by metal detector. Now, the Hoard, of course, belongs to the early medieval period in England. That is, of course, circa 450 to 650. And this period needs little explanation to you all, of course. Suffice to say that what is important to regard is the general context of the Hoard, in that it dates to a time of very considerable political and religious change. It dates to the end of that period. I am, of course, referring to the period of kingdom formation and of the conversion to Christianity of those kingdoms, which took place from the late 6th century well into the 7th century. Now, this cauldron of bloody warfare, of state formation and of intellectual dynamism was the backdrop to the Staffordshire Hoard. Now, as a student of this period for over 2 decades, I've very much come to know this as the Anglo-Saxon period. In recent years, this term has become somewhat controversial, so I shall today try to avoid using it. But please know that if I do lapse, I use the term only for cultural history purposes and without prejudice. So what does the Hoard contain? Following the tasks of cleaning, conserving and reassembling, from almost 4,600 fragments, something in the region of 700 objects emerged. Whilst the majority of the fragment relationships were identified by 2014, some objects did not fully emerge until right at the end of the project. One example is a silver socketed stand that's shown in the bottom left of this slide, which we believe was a stand for the Hoard's Great Gold Cross, and it was reconstructed from 66 silver sheet fragments. And this example underlines the fragility of the silver material in the collection, which has caused an inverse relationship between weights and fragment counts in the hoard. In total, there is 4 kilograms of gold objects compared to 1.7 kilograms of silver objects, shown in the top pie on this slide. But the silver accounts for more than 3/4 of the overall collection by fragment count. Whilst many of the objects retain garnets or more rarely other inlays, there is very little copper alloy, virtually no iron, and only traces of organic materials, such as horn, wood, and wax glue pastes, though these would all have been essential components of the manufacture of the larger objects from which the fittings came, and of the objects themselves in some cases. The contents of the hoard, therefore, are highly selective, favouring precious metal. Now, the objects were drawn entirely from the possessions of men and of the apparatus of war, even arguably the Christian objects. Most come from swords, with only a small number from fighting knives known as saxes. Their array of ornaments and forms, some quite new, have transformed our understanding of these weapons, in particular the sword, their makers, and their elite warrior users. From the ends of swords and knives come pommel fittings, 3 of which are shown in the top of this slide. On the basis of the minimum number of pommels, 74, together with other types of hilt fittings, we estimate that something in the order of 100 swords were dismantled to provide the fittings in the collection. Most of the pommels take a cocked hat form, which is datable between 570 and 650, but there's also a smaller number of round back pommels, which are slightly later in date, generally. Other fittings come from the grips of weapons, like these hilt-collars and hilt-rings. They would have been fitted as shown at the top and bottom of weapon grips. From all of the gold and silver hilt-collars and hilt-rings combined, there are a remarkable 50 matching pairs. Furthermore, some of these matching pairs match with pommels. This is significant as it shows that swords in the period could be manufactured with suites of fittings, something that was not evident prior to the Staffordshire Hoard. Note in the bottom right, there is a twisted wire form of ring, and it is very like that, a pair of rings found on the famous sword from the Sutton Hoo ship burial of Mound 1. And you'll see that I will come back to this burial repeatedly in this presentation. There are a number of parallels. Now, there are over 170 hilt plates in the hoard, and these reinforced sword guards. From the forms of the plates, from marks left on them from other fittings as well, it has been possible to say where they were fitted on the hilt. Some swords, it's apparent from this, had a full complement of 4 plates, but other weapons had only a pair of plates, and in some cases only a single plate on the lower guard. Unlike the forms discussed so far, over 100 small mounts from the collection were initially less familiar, and many of these are decorated with gold filigree ornament, and in particular filigree scrollwork decoration. And it was only after a trip to the British Museum to inspect the so-called Cumberland hilt of preserved horn that their identification was possible. These fittings were made to be inserted into the recesses cut into the grip and guards of weapons, and were secured by small nails and probably some form of glue. Also, importantly, their identification on the Cumberland hilt shows that the number of weapons represented in the hoard is almost certainly greater than the minimum indicated by the 74 surviving pommels, hence our proposal of at least 100 swords. You'll note that the Cumberland hilt doesn't have a metal pommel, it has a horn pommel. And there were also pommels in the period that had, also swords in the period that had iron pommels. But they could also have had other decorative fittings. Some of the small mounts from weapon hilts are entirely new forms, though they have some foreign parallels. They include pairs and sets of animal form, again from grips. And there are also U-shaped mounts in the bottom left of this slide that were set into the tips of sword guards. It's notable that nearly all of the weapon fittings come from hilts, with only a handful of the fittings certainly from scabbards. We have very few fittings from scabbards. There are 5 pairs of pyramid fittings. You can see two examples from pairs in the top right of the slide. And there's also a pair of button fittings that would also have come from the scabbard. And you can see one of those in the bottom right of the slide. And it's seated in its stone bead that was also found within the collection. There are only 3 small buckles in the collection, and they may also have come from sword harness. In sum, the sword fittings reveal an array of styles that are best appreciated from those forming sets, some of which are shown here. These suggest that certain prevailing styles were available. Different styles, it is argued, that could reflect the outputs of different workshops serving different regions or kingdoms. So we may in effect be looking at different kingdom styles. Fittings in gold with filigree wire ornament, many with animal art designs in Saline style 2, an example of which is shown in the top left of the slide, appear most popular. Then there are matching fittings in garnet cloisonné. There's an example shown in the centre of the slide here, a pommel with 2 matching hilt collars. One of the few parallels for this style outside of the hoard is the pommel on the sword from the previously mentioned grave of Sutton Hoo Mound 1. And other cloisonné workmanship in the hoard also finds its closest parallels in the same royal Sutton Hoo assemblage, to which I shall come on to. And lastly, there are the sets of fittings in the Cumberland hilt style that I've just discussed. The metalwork that is cast that is in the collection is mostly in silver. There are a few cast gold objects, but most of the gold fittings are made of gold sheet, because it was you use less gold if you make objects from gold sheet than if you cast them in gold. Some of the silver cast fittings are amongst the earliest, like the example shown on the left of the slide here, the matching pommel and 2 hilt collars, again with animal style 2. Others are some of the latest examples from the hoard. One example shown on the right part of the slide. These represent a further possible regional or kingdom style, featuring silver fittings with gold mounts decorated with filigree and cloisonné ornament. The fusion of Germanic and Celtic art that's seen on these pieces we have called the early insular style, as we believe that it represents a precursor to that seen later from the later 7th century in manuscripts, the grand full insular style. Now, our example in the examples in the hoard are typified in particular by pommel 76, which is shown here. and it's shown with one of its matching hilt collars and the pair of silver guards that we believe also went with it. And there's a reconstruction that we've had produced of it, and it shows what a grand piece it would have been. Certainly fitting to a warrior noble, if not a prince. The hoard also, of course, contains other objects. Although 80% of the collection is made up of fittings from weapons, one of the other key objects, of course, is the already iconic helmet. It's a crested helmet. It is similar to examples from Scandinavia and England, most notably, again, that from Sutton Hoo Mound 1. It was originally largely golden in appearance, we believe. Nothing remains, however, of its original iron cap, so reconstruction of it, the reconstruction being shown here, was a considerable challenge. These surviving structural parts include a two-section crest piece shown in the top left here, and a pair of silver gilt cheek pieces on the bottom right of the slide, both of which are decorated with complex style to animal art. The crest would have held a horsehair or similar material, we believe, a feature that isn't found on any other contemporary helmets, but is well known on the ultimate models for early medieval helmets, Roman helmets. There is also a silver band that came from the bottom edge of our helmets, from the bottom edge of the cap, that held a die-impressed sheet showing kneeling or running warriors, and that's the bottom left of this slide. And other figural imagery of marching and riding warriors also adorned the cap. George Speake undertook much of the study of this helmet for the project, and he has concluded it was a helm that was very much fit for a king. Also different to the many weapon fittings are the over 20 large mounts that form multiple sets in the collection, many of those in gold being heavily inlaid with garnets. And we believe, based on the similarity of manufacture and quality of manufacture, that possibly all of these sets originated from a single workshop. Some could come from ostentatious military parade gear, like a saddle in the case of a set that's inlaid with filigree serpent panels, and that's the bottom left of this slide. Other fittings in silver may be from a horse's bridle, and that's the top left of the slide. And then there are fittings that we believe may have come from religious trappings, such as mounts from perhaps a reliquary container or a battle ark, just shown in the top right here. There is much speculation in many of these interpretations. And this is because ultimately it is the case that we have very few parallels for many of these objects. An object which surely must relate to the new role of Christianity on the battlefield is the collection's inscribed strip, with its Latin Old Testament quote that is unambiguously bellicose. And Gameson's translation of this: "Arise, O Lord, and may your enemies be torn apart, and those who hate you will flee from your face." Also different to the many weapon fittings of the The collection's famous great gold cross was found folded, but would have stood at about 30 centimetres tall. It could have been carried into battle or placed in a stand on an altar, or it may have fulfilled both functions. Based on the late Roman and early Christian tradition of the crux gemmata, the jewelled cross, its gold and blood red garnets would have recalled the cross of victory of the Emperor Constantine. The later poem, The Dream of the Rood, describes very well the visual impact of such an object, which was probably foremost a talisman of conquest. The vision was all covered with gold, beautiful gems appeared at the corners of the earth, and there were also 5 upon the crossbeam, it reads. On the cross, the red garnet bosses symbolise the 5 wounds of Christ, with a 6 gemmed mount at the base representing the Mound of Golgotha. But this Christian iconography was combined with a Germanic art of the pre-Christian age, the fluent interlace and animal ornament known as Sarline style too. Significantly, one animal art motif is a rare copy of decoration seen on cups in the Sutton Hoo Mound 1 burial. By its style, this cross dates to around the mid-7th century. The other object, shown here on the right, is unparalleled. It also has Christian symbolism combined with animal style too, and it is technically and artistically linked with the cross. Leslie Webster has argued that it is a bishop's headdress, a 7th century version of a Jewish high priest's headgear, as portrayed here in the image of Ezra from the Codex Amiatinus manuscript. I've mentioned several times already the connection between the metalwork of the Staffordshire Hoard and that from Sutton Hoo, and this is a slide that summarises some of those linkages. Now, these extend beyond general observations concerning the quality of manufacture to include certain signature details, which I believe support an argument that a proportion of the objects in the collection originated from workshops in the Kingdom of East Anglia. A key connection already mentioned is that between the motif on the cross and the cups in the top left of this slide. There is also the frequent use in the hoard of so-called mushroom cell work in the Cloisonné. And this type of cell work achieved notable popularity in the Kingdom of East Anglia. And then there is a further affinity that is seen in the animal art of the Staffordshire Hoard and in the animal art of Sutton Hoo, and that is a Y-shaped feature, a Y-shaped division seen on the beaks of birds, both in Cloisonné and in other forms of animal art. And that's summarised in the bottom left of this slide. Working out the origin of other objects in the collection is far from straightforward, in large part due to the lack of parallels for many of the hoard's extraordinary forms. For example, the dominant gold filigree style represented by pommels and hilt collars from swords has its best parallel in objects found by the Portal Antiquities scheme. However, unfortunately, many of these have poor context. Overall, they show a dispersed picture. Nevertheless, if we look at the little gold triangles on this map, we see that there's a lack of them south of the River Thames. And they suggest perhaps that the filigree metalworking style could have emanated in an Anglian territory, perhaps the Kingdom of Lindsey, from whence they dispersed, or perhaps probably from the powerful northerly neighbour of Lindsey, Northumbria. Nor has it been straightforward to establish a chronology for the objects in the collection, again due to their rare character, as well as an entire absence of any coins, and to date we haven't been able to have any radiocarbon dating done on our rare organics. Most important for dating, therefore, has been the animal art in the collection, as its development has long been studied. Sarline's style 1 animal art of the later 5th and 6th centuries occurs on just a single pair of objects, shown on the left of this slide, a pair of silver hilt collars. And these may be the oldest objects in the hoard, dating to about 550 AD. So they were very old, probably even when they came into the collection. In comparison, the later subsequent style of Saline style 2 occurs on over 140 objects. Now, my research on the Staffordshire Hoard has proposed two versions of animal style 2. An early style 2, which comprises highly abstract animal-like creatures known as zoomorphs. And this dates to about 570 to 630. And then there is a later form of the style, which actually has more recognizable quadruped creatures shown in profile. And this dates to about 610 to 650. These two types of art forms, the two types of style 2, have been dated for the Staffordshire Hoard project based on objects from graves found across Europe, including in Anglo-Saxon England. And so on this slide, I've summarised the 4 phases of metalwork that I believe make up the collection. Now, the earliest phase at the bottom is a group of silver fittings, and all of these were made in the 6th century, and they probably came from antique, probably heirloom weapons that were already old when they came into the collection, the hoard, when they were dismantled. The vast majority of the collection, the gold material, belongs to 2 central phases. A Hoard Phase 2, which is characterised by the filigree ornamented objects and includes those objects with early style 2, dated to 570-630, and then another Hoard Phase 3, the second of the gold phases, and that comprises the objects with garnet cloisonné and later style 2, and especially those garnet cloisonné objects with affinities to Sutton Hoo. Our final phase of objects, shown at the top, is again another phase of silver objects, and those are the silver objects of the early insular style that I've already mentioned. Now, we believe, based on the dating of the latest finds in the hoard, these latest objects with early insular style, that our hoard was buried sometime between 650 and 670 AD. Our key aid to establishing the dating was to consider the evidence for wear and repair on objects. On the whole, it was found that the degree of wear correlated broadly with the age of the objects that we deemed based on their style. For example, many of the gold filigree sword fittings of Hoard Phase 2 showed moderate to heavy wear. There's an example in the top right of this slide. Silver pommel in the top left is another example of an early object with very heavy wear to its apex. In addition, the wear patterns gave an indication of how the objects were used. The red areas on the schematic in the bottom right of this slide show that we believe that the majority of the sword fittings took their wear as a result of being worn at the waist and rubbing against clothing. At some point, the assemblage underwent extensive damage, and as the fittings were systematically and crudely stripped away from the swords and other objects from which they came. Much of this was done with knives, and we have extensive evidence of cut marks showed cutting and levering, but there were also compression marks that indicated the use of smithing tongs. Possibly, this indicates the rapid stripping of fittings for the purposes of bullion, and that the objects were ultimately to be recycled. However, this explanation overlooks the extremely selective character of the objects, as we've already established, that are the supreme symbols of the power of a king rather than a random sample from a royal treasury. The alternative explanation for this damage could be that the hoard represents an ideological act, a way of deactivating the symbolic power of the objects, the swords in particular, and the helmet, perhaps as part of the defeat and humiliation of a rival army. The apparently deliberate removal of one arm of the collection's pendant cross, shown in the bottom right here, for example, is one instance of this seemingly deliberate damage, and the smashing of the helmet into over 1,000 fragments is another. Of course, recycling might also have accommodated such acts, but ultimately the task was interrupted by unknowable events, leading instead to burial. And moving now onto this discussion of what our hoard represents. In the final few slides, I want to consider that. To recap, in its material, art and symbolism, it belongs to the pinnacle of 7th century Anglo-Saxon masculine warrior society. It represents the powers, secular and spiritual, on which kings depended. Yet it was fragmented, deliberately dismantled, and so very selective in its contents. Unfortunately, evidence relating specifically to the hoard's fine context is limited. Our explanation for the hoard, therefore, must draw generally on historical and archaeological knowledge from the early medieval world. While the hoard artifacts can be compared generally to high-status finds elsewhere, there is nothing that matches the combination of massed weapon fittings, precious material and fragmentation. The war booty wetland sacrifices of South Scandinavia and North Germany are interesting to compare, such as those from Nudum, but they are earlier, geographically removed, and contained whole weapons, mainly spears and shields. Treasure hoards are abundant from late 4th and 5th century Roman and sub-Roman Britain, as well as from 4th to 7th century mainland Europe and Scandinavia, but all are different in character. Moreover, and more importantly, hoards as a whole are very rare in contemporary early medieval England. Regarding the context of burial, we have very partial evidence. Only 13% of the 4,600 fragments had known locations. Spread over 215 square meters and entirely within the plough soil, the distribution nevertheless indicates a core area of some 3 to 4 square meters. The original find included 21 soil blocks containing a mixture of small fragments, especially of silver. These came from a 2 meter square area, probably but not certainly the same area with the concentration shown on the plan here. But the ploughing and the final disturbance of the treasure had removed all evidence of any such pit, which must therefore have been shallow. The only indication of a possible container was a single fragment of textile. Lastly, but importantly, found at some distance were fragments from a single discoidal horse harness mount, shown in the bottom right of the slide here, in gilded copper alloy. It was not part of the hoard, but the style of its interlace has similarities with that on the latest objects of the early insular style. It suggests, therefore, that it was deposited at the same time, or about the same time, perhaps even having been lost by an individual present at the time of the hoard's burial. And moving on now to conclude. I've stated that the Staffordshire Hoard was buried around the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. Its fine spot then lay within Mercia, a border territory that at this date was probably a patchwork of small folk groups. Mercia was not yet the powerhouse it would become in the 8th century. According to Bede's Ecclesiastical History and the later Historia Brittonum, the kingdom was born of protracted warfare waged by its pagan ruler Penda, mainly against Anglian neighbours to the east, and notably Northumbria and East Anglia. We have, of course, suggested that some of the objects in the hoard might have derived from these same kingdoms. The 650s to 670s were particularly turbulent for Mercia. Penda died following the Battle of Wynwerd in 655, and a year later his recently converted son, Pera, was murdered, before another son, Wulfhere, was eventually restored to the throne. The hoard was thus deposited at the very edge of early England, at the border with the British West. A significant setting is also indicated at the local level. Politically, the fine spot appears between the folk territories of the Pensacate and the Thomasate. The Mercian bishopric of Lichfield was founded nearby in 669, and Tamworth was to develop as a secular centre. So the location can also be said to lie in or near the Mercian royal heartland. Most significantly, the site is beside Watling Street. The modern A5 still preserves its route. The major Roman road that led into Mercia from southeast England, and it is near its junction at Wall with Ricknield Street, the route northwards into Northumbria. The site was thus eminently accessible, but it was also out in the landscape, exactly the sort of place that was used in prehistory for ritual deposits and in the early medieval period for assemblies. So to conclude, there are thus multiple possibilities for explaining the Staffordshire Hoard, as well as many uncertainties. Today I've only been able to give you a glimpse of the arguments, and I'm fully aware that there is much scope for future further debate, questions, and I hope research. In the end, it is impossible to say why the hoard was treated as it was. There are two leading suggestions that emerged from our project were that it was a royal Mercian treasure, possibly derived from captured battle loot that was in transition between decommissioning and recycling, but that completion of this was arrested by some unknown circumstance, leading ultimately to a final and hurried burial, or that it was the deliberate and permanent removal of royal treasure from circulation for political, superstitious, or religious reasons. And that concludes my talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely brilliant. I'm sure that people will want to show their appreciation in the chat or using the sort of digital hand clap as they do at Zoom.